We have our own events calendar in the back, as well as the calendar for the series that this lecture is a part of, which is a part of our National Endowment for Humanities funded colloquium series, which this year is exploring the theme of fleeing genocide, displacement, exile, and the refugee. This year's program is coordinated by 3 QCC faculty members who are here today: Kathleen Alves, Eliza Adek, and Myrna Lekic. They're all standing in the back, giving up their seats nobly so that we all may be comfortable. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our introducer and moderator for today's event, Professor Trevor Milton.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Man, you said so much of what I was going to say. But I wanted, first of all, to thank everybody for being here, and also to bring to your attention that this is a series that's been going on since the beginning of last fall. And this is something that, if you can, please pay attention to, obviously, today's event and other events going into the future. Generally focusing on exile, displacement, refugee status. All of these speakers, in my opinion at least, and I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, are so relevant to the international climate right now. In particular about refugee status. You know, even this past year, actually in 2015, there were about 1 million refugees that fled to Europe because of what's going on in Syria and in the Middle East, generally speaking. Refugees represent about, there's about 12 million refugees worldwide. And generally speaking, these are people that are seeking a safe space. Whether that is caused by genocide in a home country, whether that is caused by some sort of, in some instances, climate, natural disaster. But this is, what makes this so relevant to today is essentially how we define asylum and refugee status. Here in the United States, since 1980, we created the Refugee Act, which allowed, and I'm quoting, which allows any person living in fear of persecution to emigrate to the United States. So there's been this very broad standard of what it means to be a refugee in the United States. Again, that definition has gone on to include those that have suffered from natural disaster. Generally speaking, refugees in the United States are because of military or police actions that the United States has been involved in, and we've therefore received quite a few refugees. But at the same time, we're now in a moment in 2017 where we, as a society, are beginning to re-examine what that means and who is, and I'm going to do some quotation marks, who is deserving of that refugee status. You know, if you are running from a country where you're in fear of crime or violent crime, your family's being targeted by cartels, gang activity, should you not get that same refugee status? If it's for political status, the pattern from the 1980s was coming from a former Soviet country. But anybody that's trying to avoid persecution in their own countries, and this is obviously a hot topic now in 2017, now that we're dealing with Muslim bans, trying to figure out again who is and who is not deserving of having a safe space to be. So for today, we wanted to introduce Jacqueline Murekatete. She is a genocide survivor in Rwanda. The Rwandan genocide was something that, looking back on, it was amazing or disappointing that we didn't pay more attention to it. At the time, you had genocide that took place in 1994 over a 100-day period from April 6th to July 16th of 1994, which involved 2 ethnic groups. Hutu extremists targeting the Tutsi population of Rwanda. The low end is that 800,000 people were killed in that crisis. The high end was about 1 million people were killed in that crisis. It was, and I'm calling it a crisis, because at the time the UN refused to call it a genocide. The United States refused to recognize it as a crisis. For some reason, we've really overlooked this awful, awful thing that happened in our history. and hopefully we can make up for those mistakes later. So Jacqueline is a survivor of this genocide. She came to the United States at the age of 9. She was granted asylum as a result of the genocide there. Since then, she's done quite a bit with herself in her time here. Currently the founder of the Genocide Survivors Foundation, earned a bachelor's in politics from NYU, is a practicing attorney, earned her jurisprudence doctorate from the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. She's received several awards, just to name a few: the Global Peace and Tolerance Award from Friends of the United Nations, the Moral Courage Award from the American Jewish Community, and the Cave Family Award from the Anti-Defamation League. Jacqueline's story is amazing. And in the bio that was listed in this program, I couldn't have said it better in terms of what she's accomplished and what she can offer for you today. Jacqueline Murekatete is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. 9 years old in 1994, Jacqueline survived the genocide, but her parents, 6 siblings, and most of her extended family did not. She was granted asylum in America and taken in by an uncle in New York City, where she now lives. She began speaking about her own experiences as a victim of genocide after hearing Holocaust survivor David Gewirtzman speak at her high school. Since then, Jacqueline has delivered hundreds of genocide prevention and human rights presentations at schools, NGO events, and faith-based communities across the US, Germany, Israel, Ireland, Bosnia, and Belgium, to name a few. She's also addressed the UN General Assembly and regularly participates in high-level human rights conferences. And she continues to be a strong voice against mass violence, for remembrance, reconciliation, healing, and hope. So without further ado, Jacqueline Murekatete, after she's done speaking, I will be taking questions, so hold your questions for now. Don't worry, we're going to have time for that. But until then, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be able to share my story and the work, the human rights work that I do today. And I want to thank Dr. Lisa Attic and everyone who made it possible for me to be here this afternoon. And thank you for making the time in your schedule to come and listen, and hopefully to leave here motivated to start getting involved in trying to create a better world for all of us. So I'm going to begin my presentation by showing a very short video clip. It's about 1.5 minutes. And it's a video clip that is taken out of a larger documentary called Ghosts of Rwanda. Ghosts of Rwanda is a documentary that's available in its full version on YouTube for free. So after today, if you're interested to learn more, especially about the lack of intervention from the international community during the genocide, you can certainly go to YouTube and put in Ghosts of Rwanda and see the full documentary. But I just want to begin by showing just a little brief short clip to kind of remind ourselves visually of what was going on in my native country between April and June of 1994. So if we can just show that.
Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Ten years ago, in the small East African country of Rwanda, 800,000 people were slaughtered by their own government.
This was ordinary men, women, and children, and the only reason that they were killed was because they were Tutsi.
Virtually the entire world turned away and did almost nothing to stop the genocide.
In retrospect, it all looks very clear, but at the time, what was happening in Rwanda, the situation was unclear.
They cannot tell me that they didn't know. Everybody knew what was happening.
Tonight on Frontline, the full story of perhaps the darkest and most brutal tragedy of our time. It is a story told by the victims and by the killers, by those who turned away and by those who stayed and tried desperately to save as many people as they could.
By the time the genocide was over, I was so angry at America. America the beautiful, America the brave.
They are all still haunted by what happened.
I was the commander, and hundreds of thousands of people died. I can't find any solace in statements like I did my best.
Still haunted by the ghosts of Rwanda.
So again, very short clip, but I think it's important. I think that the human mind has a tendency to forget and to easily forget things because we are constantly bombarded by images of all types of atrocities. So I just wanted to, again, give a little visual reminder of the environment in Rwanda that myself and many others lived, and a few of us survived in 1994. But I want to, before I talk about the genocide and some of the work that I do today, some of the current issues that you are all aware of, I want to begin my presentation by talking a little bit about Rwanda before the genocide, the country in which I was born and lived with my parents and 7 siblings. I was one of 7 children in my father's household, 4 brothers, 2 sisters, many aunts, cousins, second cousins, grandparents, and it was a beautiful life that I lived. I mean, we had, certainly the life was not without problems. We had some problems, as you hear. But generally, I have to say that up until the genocide happened, I had led a relatively happy childhood. I was 9 years old, as you heard, and I had my family, and I had goals and dreams, like every other 9-year-old. And I never really thought that any of those dreams would come to the end, the abrupt end that they were about to. But just a little bit of geography. Rwanda, it's a small country in East Central Africa. It's a tiny country on the map. It is the most densely populated country in Rwanda. This is an actual map of the country. I was born in a southern province in a place called Gitarama, which you see there in South Central. But I had relatives who lived all over the country. So my mother, for example, was from a place called Gikongoro, which you also see. And I had relatives all over the places. I remember part of my childhood growing up was traveling and going to see my aunts and my cousins and my uncles. The country is known as the land of 1,000 hills because it is made up of many beautiful rolling hills. So the people who have gone to Rwanda or who travel to Rwanda today really talk about how beautiful the country is physically. And many of them wonder how it is that such a place, such a beautiful place could have experienced the chaos and the mass murder that we experienced in 1994. This is a little image of a place, a countryside of Rwanda that is very similar to my life growing up, because growing up, both of my parents were farmers. So I grew up in a countryside, lived on a farm. I had relatives who lived in a city, but I would say the majority of my relatives lived in a countryside, somewhat like that. This is the capital of Rwanda, is Kigali. It's a beautiful and growing city right now. The people who visit it always come very much impressed by how clean and how nice it looks, especially in light of, again, what happened in 1994. And as of 2016, the population of Rwanda was estimated to be over 12 million. Again, it is the most densely populated country in Africa. It's a small country, but with many people, and the government been working now to manage that. We have 3 languages, Kinyarwanda, which is our native language. But growing up, and as a result of having been under the influence of Belgians, we were also taught French when we got to 4th grade. And at the moment, English is also very much a prominent language. So if you travel there today, especially if you're in a city in Kigali, you wouldn't have any problem getting around, because many people speak English in a city, in a countryside, not so much so. And as you heard, there are 3 main ethnic groups: the Hutus, who make up the majority, over 80% of the population. Hutus, Tutsis, my ethnic group, who are the larger minority, making up about 15 to 20%. And then there's a 1% group known as Twa, which most people are not even aware of because it's a small population that was unfortunately also marginalized throughout Rwanda's history. So most people know about Hutus and Tutsis because the conflict has really, the historical conflicts have always largely dealt with the two ethnic groups. Many of us growing up, we were Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Seventh-day Adventists, mostly because of, again, the Belgian influence. First the Germans, who were the first Europeans to land in Rwanda, and then the Belgians who came and converted everyone to Christianity. So growing up, I would say, again, the large majority of the country were Christian, but we also have a 1% Muslim population. So that's the country in which, again, I was born in 1984 and was raised and lived with my parents up until I came to this country after the genocide. And growing up, I was, as I said, I led a relatively happy childhood, but I was also very much aware that I lived in a country where my ethnic group, the Tutsi ethnic group, had been discriminated against and was still being discriminated against by the Hutu extremist government that was ruling the country at that time. I grew up in a country that had an ethnic-based ID system. So when you're born in Rwanda, instead of being considered a human being or a Rwandan, you are immediately labeled as a Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, and that identity will follow you for the rest of your life. Children will put in their father's ID cards because ethnicity in Rwanda is through the father. So in case of intermarriage, if your father was a Hutu and your mother was a Tutsi, you're considered a Hutu, and vice versa. And this became very, very problematic during the genocide because you had families who were participating in killing. You had uncles who were killing their nieces. You had brothers who were killing their sisters' kids. In case their sister had married Tutsi, then their kids, the sister's children, would be considered Tutsi. So the children who found themselves in those intermarriages really experienced a lot of trauma, many of which still continues today because you have orphans now who can't speak to surviving members of their family because they witnessed those family members killing the other side of their family. But this is the reality that we went through. But again, ethnicity is through the father, and children were listed in their father's ID cards until you became of age, and then you obtain your ID card. And this ID system was really used by the Hutu-led government to discriminate against Tutsis in schools, in the workforce, certainly in the government. Because growing up, I used to hear stories from my mother, for example, about how she did so well in school, but when she applied for high school and they discovered, that she was a Tutsi, although she had passed her exams, they denied her high school. So she never went to high school, not because she didn't do well, but simply because she was a Tutsi. And this was a story of many Tutsis in our country growing up, that they were denied education beyond elementary school simply because of their ethnicity. So I was very much aware at a very early age that I lived in a country where my ethnic group were really treated as a second-class citizens. And I also grew up in a country that had many propaganda against Tutsis. The Hutu government had constructed this anti-Tutsi narrative where they said that Tutsis were foreigners who had migrated to Rwanda from other parts of East Africa. Specifically, they said they had come from Ethiopia and they had controlled and oppressed Tutsis. So there was this narrative that portrayed Tutsis as not as true Rwandans, like the Hutus and Twas, but as foreigners. And this is the type of narrative that Hutu children grew up hearing and being taught in school. So in a classroom like this, the teacher will come once in a while and he'll talk about how Tutsis were foreigners and how to oppress the Hutus. So from very early age, Hutu children were really put into this mindset where they saw Tutsis as us, like us versus them. This was the mentality in Rwanda. It was always us versus them, and these people are foreigners. They just want to take power and oppress us. And this is a kind of narrative that was taught formally within the Rwanda's educational system. I also grew up in a country where, although the 1994 was the largest killing of Tutsis, as you heard, it's estimated that between 800,000 and over 1 million people were murdered in just 100 days. So that was the largest killing, but it wasn't the first. Because growing up, I also grew up with stories from my parents and grandparents about the earlier massacres of Tutsis in 1959, the 1960s, and the 70s. So throughout Rwanda history, really post-independence Rwanda, after Rwanda gained independence from the Belgians in 1962, from then on, actually starting 59, when the Tutsi monarchy was overthrown, up until 1994, there had been a number of massacres against Tutsis. And those massacres had actually produced a large number of Tutsi population who lived outside Rwanda, in Uganda, Burundi, Congo. So when the genocide began, there was a large number of Tutsi refugees living outside of Rwanda because of, again, the earlier massacres. So with all this, I was aware that I was in a country where at any point the government could say, kill Tutsis, and Tutsis will be killed, and always with impunity. We had a culture of impunity where people killed, and the government said stop, they stopped, but the people whose families were killed, they never got justice. It was a culture of impunity. And all these things really, I think, are what enabled the genocide in 1994 to happen, because for a very long time, before April 1994, Rwanda had been a country where it had been made okay to kill Tutsis and get away with it. And this is something that I always emphasize, because it's very important for me when I speak about this topic to help audiences understand that genocide as a crime is not a crime that happens overnight. People don't get up one day out of nowhere and want to target their neighbors or their students or their teachers. This is something that happens over a period of time. Those of you who have studied the Holocaust, who have studied other genocides, we know that this is a process where people are discriminated against first, then they are dehumanized, then they are finally exterminated. But it's a process, and because it's a process, I always say that there is always an opportunity for us to intervene and to speak out early enough to prevent situations from becoming genocides, because it doesn't just happen. It's preceded by discrimination, by dehumanization. There was a lot of training of Hutu civilians before the genocide. There are records now of machetes, large numbers of machetes being imported to Rwanda, as you will hear in this documentary, Ghosts of Rwanda. For no other purpose than the government was importing the machetes for no other purpose but to carry out a genocide that the government was planning. And many people within the international community, including our country here, knew that these things were happening, because at that time, the UN had a UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, because in 1990, this is another bit of a background, in 1990, Rwanda was going through, starting 1990 up to 94, there was a civil war going on in Rwanda, where the refugees, the Tutsi refugees, as I mentioned, who had lived in exile for decades, were trying to fight to come back to Rwanda, because they had been living in refugee camps in Uganda, in Burundi, in Tanzania, and they were asking the Hutu government to allow them to come back to their country. But the Hutu government said there was no more room for Tutsis, that the Tutsis who were still in Rwanda, like my family, were the only Tutsis that the country could hold, that there was no room. So once these Tutsi refugees were refused peaceful entry, they organized themselves into a movement called RPF, or Rwandan Patriotic Front. And in October 1990, they started attacking Rwanda. So up until the genocide, there was a civil war going on. And when the civil war began, the situation of Tutsis, like my family living in Rwanda, worsened, because the government started saying that Tutsis living in Rwanda, like my family, were spying from the Tutsis outside, when in fact, many of us didn't really have contact, because as I said, most people lived in a countryside, we didn't have telephone, we certainly didn't have internet, so there was really no means of communication except when somebody managed to come and visit you. But this was being used, the civil war was being used as a way for the Hutu government to start mobilizing Hutu civilians for this genocide that the government was planning. But so when the Civil War started, things got worse. The dehumanization got worse. I remember a few months before the genocide, we used to listen to radio where Tutsis would be, like government-sponsored radio and newspapers, where Tutsis would be described as not as human beings, but as a disease, like as a sickness that needed to be cured. Tutsis would be described as cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. So I always say that way before the genocide, the minds of the Hutu civilians who ended up participating in the genocide had been conditioned and prepared and indoctrinated. And this is why when the genocide actually began, when the actual killings began, the killings were, the genocide in Rwanda is described as the fastest genocide that there's been, although it was carried out by, machetes and not with tanks and machine guns. It was neighbors killing neighbors. The government turned against Tutsis, the Hutu neighbors turned against Tutsis, and the killings were very efficient. And that's why, again, it's estimated that over 1 million people were killed in just a little over 3 months. And when the genocide began, life as we knew it changed. When the genocide began, I happened to be in my grandmother's village in Gikongoro, my maternal grandmother's village. And one of the first things that the government did was that as soon as the genocide began, the government asked that roadblocks be placed throughout Rwanda. And they also asked that anybody who attempted to travel, you had to carry your identity card. As I said, people had ID cards. So when the genocide began, it became nothing less of suicide for a Tutsi to attempt to go anywhere. Wherever you were, you tried to find refuge, you tried to find somebody to hide you tried to survive. So because of that, I could no longer go to my parents' village. My father and my older brother who used to come and get me, they could no longer come because, again, it would have been nothing less of suicide for them to come. And I didn't mention that the spark for the genocide was the killing of the president. So on the evening of April 6th, as you heard, on the evening of April 6, 1994, the president of Rwanda was killed. His plane was shot down as he was coming back from to Rwanda from Tanzania, where he had gone to negotiate a peace treaty with the rebel group that I mentioned. And on his way to Rwanda, his plane was shot, him and everybody else who was with him, they were killed. And that same night, Hutu extremists started going on the radio and saying the Tutsis had killed our president. They said all Tutsis deserve to die. They started saying, Hutus, you need to get up. And they would speak in terms of euphemism. You need to go and cut the tall trees, because Tutsis were portrayed as being tall. And they would say, go kill the tall trees, go to work. This is a euphemism in Rwanda that we knew meant now going to the farm. Going to work meant, at that time, going to kill your Tutsi neighbors. So beginning of April 6, 1994, Rwanda became really chaos. Again, wherever you are, you try to find somebody that could hide you, but the chances of survival were very low. This is why those of us who survive, sometimes I talk to other survivors, and we don't know how we survived, because when the government turns against you and your neighbors turn against you and the borders are closed, there were roadblocks everywhere, like how do you even survive? It's nothing less than a miracle. And the few people who did stand up and try to hide people. But from the very beginning, because of the roadblocks, I was separated from my parents and my siblings. And I remained with my grandmother and some of my other maternal relatives. And when the killings reached our village, because the killings initially began in Kigali, in the capital, but every hour, every day, they were spreading to the rest of the country. When the killings began in our country, in our village, in my grandmother's village, when the Hutu neighbors picked up machetes and started killing, my grandmother, myself, and some of the other Tutsi neighbors, we initially ran away to a county office, what would be similar to a county office or a mayor's office here, because we thought that we would be protected, or some people reasoned that if people could at least get together in large groups, people could try and fight the people who were coming to kill them, would try to put up a fight. So my grandmother, my cousins, some of my mother's uncles and her cousins. Really, at the end of the day, when we got to that county office, there were thousands of Tutsis who had fled there, again, in hopes of being able to survive, to protect themselves by fighting, or in the hopes that the mayor that they had thought that maybe he would try to protect us, but that was not to be. So when we got to this county office, it was only a few days after we got there that our Hutu neighbors, the same Hutu neighbors whose children had grown up going to school with, the same Hutu neighbors who I used to go to church with, the same Hutu neighbors who used to come to who I used to meet at weddings or child naming ceremonies, these same neighbors, people that I knew, started coming with machetes and clubs and spears and singing and screaming that Tutsis were cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. This is a type of singing that they would sing as they were coming and killing people. And while at that county office, I witnessed many people being killed around me, men, women, and children. And it is really a miracle that I survived because nobody was to be spared, because the government, the Hutu extremists will get on the radio and they would say, even in case of pregnant Tutsi women, they would say, make sure even the fetus is dead. So the goal in 1994 was extermination. They said that they did not do a good job with the previous massacres. And this, in 1994, the goal was total extermination of Tutsis and any Hutus who sympathized or who was against that ideology of extermination. But my grandmother and I managed to survive the massacres at the county office because one of my uncles, who had been a doctor in a part of Rwanda called Butare, heard that we were there and that massacres were happening every day and that it would be a matter of time. He knew that it would be a matter of time. And where he was living at that time, the situation was still a little better. He had found somebody to hide him, so he was lucky in that he found a Hutu man who agreed to come in the middle of the night to the county office. My uncle gave him an ambulance from the hospital where he had previously worked. And this man came with an ambulance and he packed my grandmother, myself, and one of my cousins who were with us in the back of the ambulance, and he covered us with all types of clothing and things, and we left the county office. And the hope at that time was that that when we came across a roadblock, because we knew we certainly would come, because the roadblocks were guarded day and night. The story was that the Hutu man would tell the people at the roadblock that he was rushing somebody, a patient, to the hospital, a Hutu patient. And the hope was that they would not search the ambulance, because if they searched the ambulance and saw us, that would certainly have been the end of us. But given what was happening at the county office and our chances of surviving there, which were really non-existent, my grandmother knew that this was a chance worth taking. So we left in the middle of the night for that county office. We arrived in a different part of Rwanda where my uncle was hiding at that time. And he found a Hutu family who was kind enough to take us in, really at the risk of their own lives. Because in order to discourage Hutus from hiding Tutsis during the genocide, the government used to say that any Hutus who was discovered hiding Tutsis or aiding in any way, he was also to be killed, because he was considered a traitor. So people were prevented from assisting, even those who wanted to assist for that reason. But there were a few Hutu families and individuals who took that risk, just like you had righteous Gentiles during the Holocaust or other genocide we've had. And it's always important for me to mention that, because I think that it's always important for us to recognize that no matter the environment or the circumstances we might find ourselves in, there is always a choice to do the right thing. It may not be the easiest choice. It's generally not the easiest choice, but there is a choice, and people have taken that choice. And if we had more people making choices like that, things would be different. Because I always say that if Hutu civilians in 1994 had said no, had refused to participate, the genocide would not have been what it was. Maybe there have been some people, Tutsis, killed by soldiers, but it would not have been the scale, because the majority of killings were done not by soldiers, but by civilians, ordinary men and women, against their own neighbors. So that choice really is one of the things that I really try to speak about today, that people need to speak up and they need to stand up. And the more we do that, the more we can prevent these type of things from continuing to happen. My grandmother and I and my cousin, we hid with that Hutu man for a little over a week until we were discovered. I'm not sure who told the people at the roadblock, the killers at the roadblock, that we were there. But I remember one morning hearing a lot of loud screaming and banging at the door of our hiding place. And within a few minutes, my grandmother and I and my cousin, we had a group of Hutu men armed with machetes, bloody machetes. So I knew that they had been killing. On top of us, screaming at the Hutu men who was hiding us, saying, "Why do you have these cockroaches in your house? Don't you know that all Tutsis are cockroaches and all cockroaches deserve to be exterminated?" And at that moment, we thought that was going to be our end. I remember being so terrified that although I wanted to scream, I couldn't talk. I just kept praying silently in my mind, saying, "Please, God, protect us. What have we done? Why are we being killed?" And I always said that although I was a child, even at that time, I really understood the sense of injustice that was going on. The fact that myself and my family were being hunted day and night and were being murdered, not because of anything we had done, but simply because of who we are, of our ethnicity, the way we were born, the things that we couldn't change, even if we tried. So we thought that was it. And to this day, when I talk about that particular incident, that particular moment when we faced death again, I always say that I have no logical explanation of why we survived. I think it was nothing less than a miracle. The man who was hiding us kept pleading and begging the men who had come to kill us, saying, "Please, this is an old woman. My grandmother was in her 60s. These are children," talking about me and my cousin. "How can you say they're the enemies of a country?" The men kept saying it doesn't matter the age, it doesn't matter the sex, all Tutsis are cockroaches. This is the kind of message they were hearing every day, 24/7 on the radio. But he kept begging, but for one reason or another, the men who had come to kill us left. They left us. But they told the Hutu men that he had to kick us out of his house, because if he didn't, they would come back. And if they came back and were still there, they would not spare us. So once they left, we knew that we had to leave. We didn't really know where to go, because we're also in a part of Rwanda where we didn't know people. We didn't know. But the Hutu man who was hiding us, it was at that time that he told my grandmother that he knew of an orphanage that was nearby, and that had been founded and was still being managed by 2 Italian priests who had come to Rwanda before the genocide and set up this orphanage and used to care for children whose parents had died of malaria and diseases, other natural causes. And when the genocide began, these 2 Italian priests were among the very few foreigners who, at the risk of their own lives, also made the choice to stay in Rwanda and to try to protect children who are coming into the orphanage, seeking refuge. And I say the very few foreigners because, as you saw in a short clip, once the genocide began, the embassies closed, the diplomats, businessmen, all the foreigners who had been working in Rwanda, they left. They left because they knew that a genocide was going on. And this is why today nobody can say that they didn't know. If somebody said they didn't know, they're lying, because they did know. But these 2 Italian priests had stayed, and they were at that time trying to at least try to rescue children. It was too risky for them to try to protect adults. So once my grandmother was told about this orphanage, she knew that if anywhere we had more chances of surviving, my cousin and I. She knew that she would not be allowed because, again, the priests were not taking any Tutsi adults because they believed that it would create a greater risk if they took in adults. So they were trying to take in very, very young children. But the Hutu men agreed that to take us. My grandmother knew we had more chances. She told us, "Do not worry, I'm going to find somebody else to hide me, and the genocide is going to end soon, and we're going to be reunited." And every morning when we got up and were still alive during those 100 days, we used to tell ourselves that there is no way this thing is going to continue. Either our own government is going to come to its senses and stop, or certainly an outside country is going to hear about what is going on. And if they do, at that time I believed, maybe I was young and naive, but I believed that if people knew, they would come and they would help us. So I used to pray every day that somebody will find out and they will come and they will rescue us, because Rwanda is a very tiny country that if any country really had wanted to do something, they would have done a great deal in saving lives. But my grandmother told us not to worry, we'll see each other again, things will get better. But the day that I left for the orphanage, the day that my cousin and I left for the orphanage, ended up being the last day that we would see our grandmother again, because once we got to the orphanage, we were separated from her. We didn't hear from her anymore. And then after the genocide, we learned that she had been killed shortly after she sent us to the orphanage because she had not found somebody to hide her, and she was killed. To this day, we don't know exactly where she was killed, so we never were able to find her body, which is very painful for experience for survivors who are always attempting to find out exactly where their loved ones were killed. And many of them tried to find their bodies and give them proper burial, but for many survivors, that has not been the case. So with my grandmother, we never knew exactly where she was killed. Some people told us that they saw her walking, us looking for people to hide, but then they never. But that was the last time that I ever saw her. And once we got to the orphanage, my cousin and I, we met other children who were there seeking refuge. As the genocide continued, more and more children came there. So at the end of the day, there were hundreds of children who were there. And initially, the orphanage was a safe haven, but as the genocide continued, there were times when we used to have the Hutu militias or sometimes Hutu civilians come inside the orphanage and tell the Italian priests that they were going to separate the children on ethnic basis, and they were going to kill all Tutsi children. And every time those things happened, we thought that we were going to be killed. There were many attacks that I experienced in that orphanage. Many nights we were woken up and told that we were going to be killed. Each time we thought we were going to be killed. The priests would beg, they would bribe, they used. By the time the genocide ended, I remember we didn't really have food to eat because of the priests had used the money and then the food, anything that they had in the orphanage to try and ward off the killers, try to bribe them. But they did their best, and because of their efforts, myself and more than 300 other children survived in that orphanage. While in the orphanage, I, of course, and during the entire duration of the genocide, I had absolutely no communication, no information about my parents, where my parents were, where my siblings were. Many of my relatives had no communication. I didn't know where they were. But I remember every night during the genocide, I used to pray that my parents were alive, that my siblings were alive, that somebody was hiding them. I really had convinced myself of this truth, and I think it's one of the things that really helped me to keep going, because I always said, this is going to be over, and I'm going to find my parents, I'm going to find my grandparents, and everything's going to go back to normal. But once the genocide ended, the genocide was brought to an end by the RPF, the rebel group that I mentioned. Because as the genocide of Tutsis was going on in Rwanda in 1994, there was also a parallel civil war going on, as I said, between the government, the Hutu government that was carrying out the genocide, and the rebel group made up mostly of Tutsis who had been living in exile for many years, but also as well as Hutus who were opposed to the extremist Hutu regime. So that civil war is going on. Unfortunately for us, the RPF won the war against the genocidal regime, and they're the ones who stopped the genocide approximately 100 days after it began. And once the genocide began, those of us, those children like myself who had survived in the orphanage, we began hoping and trying to find out whether our families had survived. I remember every morning all of us used to go at the gate of the orphanage hoping that the next person who entered was our own relative and that we will get out, because none of us obviously wanted to spend our lives in the orphanage. And one day I was very fortunate in that one of my mom's cousins and one of my cousins, they came into the orphanage. It turns out that the uncle that I mentioned, my uncle who I mentioned who had sent the ambulance for us at the county office, he had survived. Miraculously, he had found somebody who hid him, who dug a hole and hid him, and he survived. And after he survived, he went back to the Hutu men he had left my grandmother and my cousin with, and then the Hutu men told him, it was him who informed him that he had taken us to the orphanage. So my uncle then sent my cousins to come and get us, and we left the orphanage. And once we left the orphanage and we were reunited with my uncle, of course, the first thing that I asked him was to take me to my parents' village. At that time, he had already told me that my grandmother had not survived, his mother, because he had found out that she had not survived. And he also knew at that time that my parents had not survived, but he had not told me about it. So I started telling him, I want to go back to my parents' village. I want to see my parents. I want to see my siblings. And for a while, he didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to hear of it. He just kept saying, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. And, but at some point, he had no choice but to tell me what he had learned. And what he had learned was that one day during the genocide, My Hutu neighbors had taken my father and my mother and my 4 brothers, my 2 sisters, my uncle, my grandmother, most of my relatives, and the other Tutsis in the village. These Hutu mobs had come and they had taken them to a nearby river where they had proceeded to murder them one by one and to throw their bodies in that river. So I never, had the opportunity to, I never had the opportunity to bury them. This is a situation with many survivors, as I said. There's no tombstone for them in Rwanda. But that's a reality that I had to deal with after the genocide. And for a while, I couldn't really understand how it is that within a matter of, again, over 3 months, my life had changed in such a way that I had never imagined. I had went from a life where I had my parents, my siblings. Yes, I was aware that I lived in a country that had many injustices, but I had my family, and I had my goals, and I had my dreams. And within 100 days, I was a genocide orphan who had experienced the horrors that I had experienced, and I was being told that my family had been murdered simply because who they were, and by none other than my neighbors. And for a long time after the genocide, I really struggled to deal with my experiences. I had nightmares. I had all kinds of problems. Not just me, but the other genocide orphans and widows who were fortunate to survive. But I was one of the fortunate genocide orphans in that I had an uncle who lived in the U.S. So after finding out that I had survived, my uncle, who is my mom's brother, he decided to bring me to this country. So in 1995, just a year after the genocide, I came to this country. I was 11 at the time. I didn't speak a word of English. I was placed in school in 5th grade where I started learning English, and my uncle helped me to apply for asylum, as you heard. So I was given asylum and later got my green card and then my citizenship. And I always say that today, I'm not sure where my life would have been if I wasn't able to come here. Like, I don't even know if I would still be alive, because whenever I go to Rwanda now, because there were many survivors who were killed after the genocide, and whenever I go to Rwanda now, and I work with survivors, as you heard, I run an organization called Genocide Survivors Foundation, and it's very difficult to see how the lives of orphans and widows who survived. Many of them were killed, many of them are dying even today. So that to this day, I really do thank God that I was given the opportunity to come here and to be able to build a new life for myself. And when I came here, it took me a very long time to share my experience. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to speak about it. And it wasn't until I was a sophomore in high school in Queens Village. That's why I went to high school, Martin Van Buren High School. Some of you may know of it. When I was 16 and a sophomore in high school, my classmates and I read the book Night by Elie Wiesel. And after we read the book Night, we had the opportunity, my English teacher, Miss Goldstein, invited a Holocaust survivor, David Gertzman, to come and share his experience. And David spoke to us about his life during the Holocaust, how his life also had gone from him being a happy child with family, friends, goals, and dreams, to him finding himself in extermination camps, losing his family. And I remember that listening to David, I really saw many similarities about what had happened to him. Although the Holocaust and genocide had happened, the genocide in Rwanda had happened decades apart, and certainly in different continents and to different groups of people, there were many similarities in that both of us were one-time children, and both of us had lost what we had lost and experienced what we had experienced for no other reason than our identity, not because we were criminals, but because of who we were. And after David spoke, I wrote him a letter. I shared briefly my experience, and he wrote back to me. And starting then, this was in 2001, he and I teamed up, and for more than 10 years, really until he passed away. Unfortunately, he passed away of cancer in 2012. Between 2001 and 2012, he and I had traveled, speaking to students like you at college campuses, high schools, churches, synagogues, conferences. And we always said that we speak and we travel and we share our stories, not because we we enjoy sharing our stories because nobody likes to have to repeat the horrors and the loss that they experience. But we speak for two reasons. One, because we want people to know what happened to our families. We want to speak for people who can no longer speak for themselves. I want people to know the type of death that my family was killed. That's one reason. But the other reason, we speak because it is our hope that by sharing our stories, we can prevent what happened to us, the suffering, the loss, from ever happening to other people, from continuing to happen. This is what motivates us, even when we get up and we don't want to go and speak. This is what motivates us, because we hope that by sharing, we can mobilize people again to make those choices of standing up and using their voice and using their resources and speaking out against this type of injustice. When you go to Rwanda today, it's a beautiful country. It's come a long way since 1994. Thank God for that. But it's also a country that has many reminders of what happened in 1994. Memorials like this one. This is a Kigali Genocide Memorial, where many people are buried. You have, during the genocide, one of the most common places where people sought refuge was in churches, because people did not believe that people could come inside the house of God and kill people. Because during the previous massacres that I had mentioned, people used to go to churches and they would survive. But in 1994, even sacred places like churches were not spared. So this is a place called Nyamata Church. It's outside of Kigali, about 40 minutes from Kigali, where 10,000 people, men, women, and children, sought refuge, and they were massacred inside church. So these, when you go there now, there are clothing and bones and all the remains of the people who were killed there. And this is just one church, but there are many churches, again, in Rwanda that are now genocide memorials. You also have memorials that talk about the children who were killed during the genocide. This is at the Kigali Genocide Memorial, where they talk about children, their age, what they liked, how they were killed. So this girl was, 12, as you see. She was hacked to death with a machete. And they do this as a way to educate the population today about the importance of peaceful coexistence, of fighting the ideology of genocide. This is David, the Holocaust survivor that I mentioned, that I spoke with for many years. Our work together really inspired me to do the work that I do today with Genocide Survivors Foundation. And our mission with the nonprofit is twofold. One is to raise awareness about not only about what happened in 1994, but about the current atrocities. Because I'm always interested not to talk about Rwanda as a historical lecture, but about how it relates today, what's happening today, whether you're talking about Syria or you're talking about Burundi or Sudan, the mass atrocity, the opportunities that exist today for us to do for people of Syria, of Sudan, what we did not do for people in Rwanda. So it's to raise awareness, and the other part is to support survivors in areas of education, economic empowerment, and social services. Moving quick so we can have enough time for Q&A. And whenever I speak, I always want to really end by helping people to think about what they can do, because it's not my goal to come here and tell you a story, a horrific story, and have you, leave here sad and paralyzed. It's my hope that by speaking to you, I can motivate you to speak up. Because Elie Wiesel, who many of you may know, he passed away unfortunately last summer, but he used to say that silence or neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to be aware. And in this day and age, with computers, with newspaper, with Facebook and Twitter and social media, there's no excuse for not being aware. It's up to us, because the information is there. And once we're aware, the question is, what do? We are aware that there are atrocities being committed, as I said, whether it's in Iraq or Syria or Burundi. These are just few of the examples. The question is, what do? Do we continue living our lives as if nothing happens? Or do we actually use our voice and the fact that we live in a country that allows us to write letters and to be on the streets and to protest and to call and hold accountable our leaders? Do we use those rights that we enjoy that many people don't have around the world? So it's always my hope to encourage people to be aware and then to get involved. And then to get involved in, nonprofit organizations. I educate people about this work, whether it's my nonprofit, whether you have a resource here with the Holocaust Center. You can speak to Dan, and, I'm sure he has opportunities for internships for you, or if not here, he can connect you to, obviously, other organizations that you can get involved in. Because at the end of the day, I really do believe that we have a moral responsibility and to get involved, but we also have practical responsibility to get involved, because especially now we're becoming aware that when things happen there and we don't get involved, they can easily have consequences for us. I think people became very much aware in recent times with the attacks in Paris or Brussels or in Germany. People are realizing that the world is interconnected, so that when we don't stop injustice or terrorism or whatever thing that's going on there, it can find us at home. So we have moral responsibility, moral reasons, but also practical responsibility. Because I always like one of the quotes by Martin Luther King, who used to say that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we need to fight an injustice, whether it's happening in Syria or in Rwanda or whether it's happening here. And this is why, some of the things that are going on in our country right now has been really troubling for me as somebody who experienced a genocide, as somebody who was granted asylum, as you heard, and given the opportunity to come here and to be able to rebuild my life. I have to say that I was shocked and deeply troubled. For example, when the immigration ban, the executive order was issued, I couldn't really believe something like that would happen in America. I grew up in this country where we are taught that this is a country of immigrants. This is a country that has these values of welcoming people and helping people, where we're trying to engage the world in a constructive way. But we found ourselves recently in this mentality of us versus them. You hear about them and us and that type of rhetoric. And I couldn't believe when I was reading, when the executive order was first issued, and I saw that they were banning, refugees from Syria indefinitely. I was like, how is that possible? I mean, we've been hearing about what's happening in Syria. People are being targeted, massacres are happening. Children, women, they are being, targeted. And this country has a history. I mean, we have a history of turning away people too. During the Holocaust, there were many people who sought to get here and they were refused. But we also have a history of welcoming, people, and there had been progress in the past years to really welcome refugees. I know many people, families, not just Rwandans, but whether it's Somalis or Congolese or from Europe as well, who've been able to rebuild their lives because of the refugee program here. So when I saw and was reading about, this ban of Syrian refugees indefinitely, and of course the other aspects of the ban, we are aware of them, of banning people from these, 7 countries that are prominently Muslim countries, I couldn't believe it. And I was really happy when people went on the streets, all the protests that have been going on throughout the country, all the phone calls, all the letters, because I really believe that this is the only way. And look what happened. Right? People protested, they reacted, and, people went to the courts, as the Ninth Circuit, the Court of Appeals struck down the immigration ban, and that was because of who? Because of people, because of what people did. People said, no, we're not going to do this. Obviously, we know that battle has not been won yet, because we know that the executive order is being revised as we speak right now, and the question is how is it going to look like now? Is it going to be discriminatory as it was before? Is it going to ban people that really shouldn't be banned? And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that nobody's trying to infringe or to put Americans or all of us, nobody's trying to put us in danger. I think that every government has the right and indeed the obligation to protect its citizens from danger, from terrorism. And I also know that there are people who are going to use, crisis, ill will, people who may try to use crisis to enter a country and, do damage. Those people do exist. But the good news is that U.S. has really the most rigorous, vetting system, screening system. To get here as a refugee, you have to go through months of background checks. So we should feel secure that this is a country that really doesn't just say everybody's welcome, whether you're a terrorist or you're a legitimate refugee. There definitely needs to be a distinction between legitimate refugees of mass atrocities and those wishing to do harm. And this government has been doing a good job doing that. And we are all for improving that system and making sure that, our lives are not in danger, making sure that we are okay. But at the same time, we can't use these type of fears or fear-mongering as a way to say, to dismiss or put a ban on entire groups of people. And I always say this is really not like a political issue. It's really a human rights issue. When you start saying that people from this country or people who are this race or people who are this religion are not welcome here, this is a very dangerous rhetoric. This is the kinds of things that I talk about in Rwanda when you tell people, put people in a mind of us versus them. There's no us versus them. It's really only us. So I am all for screening and vetting, but really I do hope that when this executive order is revised, this type of discriminatory measures or aspects of whatever is going to be the new, the revised executive order will not, these things will not be part of it. And if they're part of it, I hope that the movement and people will continue to speak up and to say that this is not American, this is against our values, this is not the way that U.S. should be engaging the rest of the world, because we really have a reputation. And I always say that, again, I'm grateful to have grown up in a country that has so many rights for its citizens, that welcomes people, and that has a capacity, the most powerful country in the world, to do so much good. And I really hope that we can continue in that route. And it's up to each and every one of you to hold our government accountable and to make sure that that's the type of country that we're going to continue to live in, a country that's welcoming, that, yes, does work hard to protect us from, terrorism or any other dangers, but that's not discriminatory against any group of people because of their identity. And it is my hope that as you live here today, you will again be involved, find a way to get involved. I have my information, I have cards. If you want to get in touch with me after today, you can get in touch with me. I'll be happy to tell you about some of the organizations that are working today, in addition to mine, to, again, speak out, but also to hopefully create a world where we have a culture of inclusion, not exclusion, and where we really work hard to make sure that every human being, irrespective of who they are or what they believe or how they look like, that their basic rights are respected and protected. And this is a world that I hope that all of us can try to work for. So thank you so much.
So, wow, this is not supposed to be that loud. I'm stepping away from things. So if you guys have any questions, I believe I have just the one mic or two, I'm not sure. I wanted to ask one question before I started passing this around and turning this down somehow. I'm just going to turn this off. What I get from your speech is that pretty much any place is at risk of an ethnic majority pointing out an ethnic minority and calling them cockroaches. Saying that they're depleting something or taking something from their country. So I'm curious, according to the Hutu propaganda, what was to gain from exterminating the Tutsis? According to the propaganda, what would be gained by exterminating this? And then if anybody raised their hands, anybody else wants a question, I'm going to walk towards you if she answers the question. Anybody have a question? Wow, nobody else? Okay, so I'm sorry, to you.
No, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I do believe that it's very easy for all of us to say this will never happen to me. It will never happen to my group of people. It will never happen to my country. But I have to say that growing up in Rwanda, despite having grown up with stories of earlier massacres in Rwanda, before the genocide actually began, I never believed that I would ever find myself in a situation like that I will see the horrors that I saw, that I experienced my family being killed. Like, I never believed it. And it's very easy for us as human beings to say, that only happens over there. It will never happen to me. But that mentality is a very dangerous one. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that given the right conditions, these things can happen really anywhere. Because when you look at the history of genocide, it has happened on every continent and to different groups of people. So it's not an issue that concerns only, Tutsis or Jews or Muslim or Christian or white. It can happen to anyone, given the right conditions. So our goal is to really make sure that those conditions are never allowed to exist. So in terms of Rwanda, the narrative really, the Hutu extremists try to teach children from a very early age, again, that Tutsis were foreigners. This is a narrative that is very debatable because some people say that Tutsis lived in Rwanda as long as the Hutus. It's a historical debate even now. But they say they came from Ethiopia. So there was this thing that they were foreigners. They came and then they took over because before the Belgians came, Rwanda was a monarchy and the king was a Tutsi. So then they came and they took over our country and they oppressed us. So they are foreigners. They are not part of us. We need to send them back. They used to say during the genocide, we're going to send Tutsis back to Ethiopia by the way of the river, meaning they will kill them, put them in the rivers, and they send them back that way. So there was that narrative. The other thing is that they really, they had this, the Tutsis were again, trying to take over, trying to monopolize power, trying to, take over schools, businesses. So people also thought in terms of, during the genocide, I always say that people killed for different reasons. There are people who killed because they had this hate in their hearts, but there are also people who killed because they knew that if they killed Tutsis, their neighbors, they could take their farms, they could take their cows. So in terms of material gain, there were certainly things to be gained if they exterminated an entire population. But for the Hutu leaders, it was really a way of trying to monopolize power. They didn't want any power sharing, and they wanted to get rid of this group of people who they always presented as a threat to their power.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Anybody else?
Questions?
I wanted to ask what... Yeah. Hi. It was a beautiful talk, and thank you for opening yourself up. I know it's not easy to go back over these stories, and it's really important. I wanted to hear more about how your friendship with David Gewurtzman helped you, what it meant to you. Because you said you were having nightmares and were traumatized. What did it mean to you to speak with someone who'd been through it and was at that stage in his life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I met David, I was a sophomore in high school. So I was 16, and he was in his 70s at the time. This mic, something happened. Again, I saw so many similarities, although he always said, I'm an old man, she's, a teenager, I'm white, she's black, I'm Jewish, she's a Christian. So it was kind of an unlikely, really, friendship, right? But when we met, because of our experiences, we really could connect on understanding that both of us, again, had been children, went through what we went through, and we were both committed to making sure that our stories were heard, and we're all, even more important, committed to making sure that what happened to us did not happen to other people. So meeting him, and again, at that time he was retired, he had his families, his children, grandchildren. Him and his wife really became very good friends and mentors. He was one of my biggest mentors. And I always say that besides the family members I lost in the genocide, when David died in 2012, it was the hardest thing that I ever went through, because up until then, I had not lost anybody that close to me, because most people perished during the genocide. But it was very difficult because we not only became, co-speakers and we spoke and so forth, but we actually became friends and family. Like I would spend, many holidays at his home. His wife is still alive. She lives in Riverdale, Bronx. So I still see her. I speak to her. When I gave birth in October to my first baby, she came and helped me a lot, and their children, friends, their grandchildren, whenever they have, whether it's bar mitzvahs or other things. So we really became a family, and I think really seeing that even out of such suffering and loss, one can still be able to rebuild their lives and have a family and have a career. That was certainly an inspiration for me, and helping me to realize that, yes, I had questions about all survivors. You always say, why me? Why did I survive? Many of us, at some point, we wish we were dead because the pain was just too much to bear. But at some point, you recognize you survived, you have responsibility. And I knew that it was indeed possible when I met David to be able to move forward, to be able to educate people, build a career, build a family, and hopefully be able to live a life that my parents, if they were alive today, would have wished. So it was a very a very wonderful friendship. And certainly when he passed away, it was very difficult. Even today, when I think about it, it's very difficult. But it was just, and I think also for the audiences, the people that we used to speak to, it was very important when we used to speak together, because students could really understand that this was not about the past and present. It was really about, it was past, present, and future. It didn't just happen and end. You know, after the Holocaust, the world said never again. Never again would a government be allowed to exterminate a group of citizens. But since the Holocaust, we've had Rwanda, we've had Cambodia, we've had Bosnia, we've had Darfur. Like, it's been a continuation. So those words, never again, are said all the time, but they are yet to become a reality. And a student seeing David and I really helped them to make that connection that the time is now, and we need to do better if we are to make sure that these things don't continue.
Can I ask? Oh, go ahead.
Are you angry on other countries that they didn't come to help you? Are you angry?
Yeah, I was very angry after the genocide. It was difficult because, again, during the genocide, as the killings were going on, those 100 days, I really did believe, even today it still boggles my mind, I believe that if a country like US, the most powerful country in the world, like you have taken very little to stop the genocide if they had the political will. I believe if they knew, or Belgium, or France, or UK, or any, or even the neighboring African countries, I believe if they knew, they would come to our rescue. I really believed it. So when I came here, and later on as I grew up, started seeing, stories like documentaries like Ghosts of Rwanda, or seeing stories of BBC, my uncle, who was living here at the time, would show me clips. There were very little media coverage because the government, they didn't want people to be aware. They tried to block it off. But there were some few short clips on CNN and BBC of bodies flowing down the river. So I was like, people were seeing this, and they had the means, but they didn't do anything. Like, I really struggled with that. And I was very angry, and I couldn't understand, like, what makes us do that? Why do we think that's okay? Just because it's happening there, it shouldn't concern us. But I also realized that was essentially the type of mentality that I would try to fight, to help people realize that it is not okay to see bodies flowing down the river, know that people are being killed simply because of who they are, and to just continue living our lives as if nothing happened, or to just say, that's pity, so sad, and move on. Like, you can actually, make a phone call or write, and if more of us can say, this is what's happening, we need you to do something, then, at the end of the day, we put our officials, they elected, we put them in office, and we can't take them out. This is the beauty of this country, that you can actually, again, you enjoy rights that many people in many countries that they don't, and it is my hope that we can use that. So it was really a process. To this day, even now, I'm still upset, and I hope that things can be different. Even when I see some of the lack of action today, it's mind-boggling. But I also do think that people are learning. Things are getting better in terms of people recognizing how much power that they have. Again, like, although I was really troubled with what happened with the immigration ban, I was also like, I couldn't believe how many people, how many protests. Like, that really reinforced my belief that, things can be better. And there are more people out there who care than people who don't care. So that's encouraging.
What was the total amount of time you were in hiding when was it your grandmother or your uncle?
What was what?
When you were in hiding.
With my grandmother.
Yeah, how many days was that in total?
We were in the county office for about a week or two, and then we were at the Hutumen's home for a little over a week. So the majority of the genocide, I was in the orphanage. I spent the majority of the genocide in the Italian-owned orphanage. And as I said, initially that was a safe haven, but as the genocide continued, there were many times when we used to be woken up and thought that we were going to be killed. But if it was not for the presence of those two Italian priests, I certainly wouldn't be here, and the 300 plus other children who survived would not be here. But yeah, the majority of the genocide, I was in the orphanage with my cousin, with my grandmother, really about like 3 weeks total. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. I want to start by saying I was very, very touched by your story, and I really admire you for how brave you are to share, because it's not easy. I wanted to ask you, how is the political, is there a tension in Rwanda right now between Tutsis and Hutus, or is just like everybody kind of ignores what happens with the genocide, or do you still remember and try to work things to like have a better relationship and not this happening again?
Yeah, so it's been, this April is going to be, 23 years since the genocide. So, the genocide ended, as I said, there was a civil war and the RPF won the war, so they took over power. So the current president of Rwanda is a Tutsi who was the leader of the RPF. And since the genocide, there have been both social and economic and political development. So that when people go to Rwanda today, it's remarkable some of the progress that have happened, but I always say that that's not to say that there's still no problems or challenges, because when you go through something like that, when you witness a neighbor who you thought you could trust, whose children you went to school with, whose children you had never hesitated to, give food to, when you witness those people either killing your family or refusing to hide you, the whole trust and the whole social fabric of a community is destroyed. And it's going to take a very long time to repair that. Because I always say, I was lucky, I left Rwanda, I was granted asylum, I'm here. There are many survivors in Rwanda who live next door to people who killed their families. Because after the genocide, there were so many people who had participated that the government realized that not everybody who had participated would be in jail. So there was an international criminal tribunal set up in Arusha, Tanzania, set up by the UN to prosecute, quote unquote, the masterminds of the genocide. These were the people in the governments who went on the radio and encouraged the killings, who drafted Tutsi lists. They were, some of them are still on the run, they're still wanted on a wanted list. But some of them were prosecuted the International Criminal Tribunal. But for the civilians, and the majority of killings were carried out by the civilians, as I said, some of them were served jail time, but some of them did not, because the government realized that they had neither the capacity or the means. They didn't have judiciary system. Like, everything was destroyed. It's not just people were killed. The infrastructure was destroyed. Judges were killed, lawyers were killed, doctors, everything. So it was chaos after the genocide. And the new government quickly realized that not everybody who participated was going to be put in jail. So when you go to Rwanda today, you have a situation where survivors live next door to people who kill their family. When they go to the river where they draw water to the well, they see them. When they go to church, they're in the same church. When they go to school, they're in the same school. And it's a very difficult reality, right? But those tough choices had to be made. So there have been a lot of efforts to try and create peaceful coexistence between Hutus and Tutsis. And thank God we've had a government that's really committed to that peaceful coexistence, because the governments we had before really always had interest on dividing people along ethnic lines as a way to monopolize power. So to the extent we have a government that's committed to peaceful coexistence, I think Rwanda is in a good place. But I always say, God forbid we ever have a government that comes back and starts saying the same type of narrative and propaganda. I'm not sure if things can't turn backwards. But the goal today of the government and the people of Rwanda is to try to educate the new generation of Rwanda, the children born today, to create an identity for them of them being Rwandans. Yes, they are Hutus and Tutsis, they are Christian, they are Muslim, but they are Rwandans first and foremost. And this is an effort that is ongoing with the hope that at one point, people in Rwanda will see themselves as Rwandans who share a common bond, and these things will not be repeated. But the work is ongoing. There've been progress, but challenges also remain, because there are some people who still have the same type of mentality. Like, once in a while, I read an article and I'll be like, okay, survivors, I read about survivor being killed here by people who killed her family or his family. So there are people who still believe that Tutsis are cockroaches that deserve to be exterminated. It's not every Rwandan, but there are some Hutus who believe that. And because of that, again, there's a need to be vigilant and to constantly educate, especially with the new generation of Rwanda, and hope that they can take the country to a better future. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, sorry. Thank you so much for sharing with us. You have a beautiful spirit, and for you to have this light that shines so brightly inside of you, despite everything you've been through, is beautiful.
Thank you.
If you can share your thoughts, because in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis are, I know there's an ethnic difference, but you're of the same skin tone. And here in the United States, we have such a problem between white people and black people. And if you can share your thoughts on what you think of the problem here in the United States, where it's even I think it's even farther beyond than just because in Rwanda, you're in the same country, you're even if there's that ethnic difference, but there's so much that you have in common. And here in the United States, it just seems impossible sometimes to cross that border and reach across between those ethnic lines. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions for that?
No, I mean, I think it's like people always find differences when they want to find differences. I really believe that. Like if it's not the skin tone, it's going to be the religion, or it can be even be the nose or the eyes. And sometimes you have leaders who have interest in dividing people. The problem is when you have really leaders who have interest in dividing people along whatever differences that they see or they construct, because again, in Rwanda, everybody's black. It's not black and white. The majority of people are Christians because of the Belgian influence. We speak the same language. There were when the Europeans, when the Germans, and then the Belgians, really the Belgians, because they're the ones who stayed long, came to Rwanda, if you go on the internet, you can Google, Belgian fathers, and you see them, they began measuring Rwandans. They measure the nose, they measure the height. So they're the ones who came up with the stereotypical image of how a Hutu was supposed to look like, or a Tutsi was supposed to look like. So they say Tutsis, they are tall, they have longer noses, they have more European features, and Hutus are this. And they issued IDs. We didn't have ID cards before the Belgians came. We didn't have ID cards. Yes, there was a monarchy. Hutu and Tutsi were more of a social classes, social class. But when they came, the Belgians literally added a physical dimension. They measured, they issued IDs, and when I was born, because my father had an ID that said Tutsi, of course I was a Tutsi. So to the extent you have leaders or people, it could be your own leaders or other leaders who have agendas and interests in dividing people, they will find a way, and they will use those differences to divide people. But David, the Holocaust survivor who inspired me to speak, he always says something that I often repeat. He always said that diversity is not adversity, right? Diversity is not adversity. Our diversity should be something that's treasured and encouraged. In America, I think it's been responsible for all the success that the country has had, diversity, and governments have to constructively manage their diversity. But when government start using diversity as a source of adversity or attention, then that's when problems arise. So in this country, I mean, one thing that I really pride myself in and feel grateful for is that I live in a country where people have rights and can exercise those rights, because not everybody can, in some countries, a president like Trump may say something like that and nobody will go on the streets, because if you go on the street, you'll be shot. They won't. We can, right? So we can really demand. So there are problems here. There are racial tensions, as you know. They are now religious tensions. They are, immigration tension about immigrants and people and so forth. But I think the solution really is it's about the leadership. If the leadership is making the right decisions and trying to help Americans realize that we have more in common than we have differences, that this country is what it is because of our diversity, and preach that message of inclusion and embracing the other, then we're going to be in a good place. But if people are dividing people, then it's a problem. So that's where our role and responsibility comes, really, is when we see people starting to paint this image of us versus them, or they, or the immigrants or the Muslims, or we need to take back our country, those kind of things. They take back the country from who? Who has taken the country? This is, except for the Native Americans, every person here is an immigrant when you really think about it. So unless the Native Americans are trying to take back their country, then, none of us are really trying to take back our country. So those things we really need to, and sometimes people say it's just talk, but words have power, and things begin with words before they become actions. So we really need to try to make sure that we hold accountable our leadership, and we try to, again, the diversity that we do enjoy, I think, should be seen as an asset, not as a problem. And if we have that mindset, then things will be good. Yes.
Okay. So I apologize, we've actually run out of time. Okay. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming. Thank our guest, Jacqueline Murekatete. Thank you. Hope everybody learned something. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. I'll answer a question. Yeah. I'd be happy to take questions. Anybody who has time.